welcome to Thirsty Thursday. Today it's gonna have to be me doing this alone because Will is out of commission. He's had an injury and so he's not here. But I wanted to really quickly chat through some of the things that are thirsty on the interwebs. So the point of this clip that we do is to sort of have a little look at what's happening in the marketing world during the week, as well as to recap our 4 a.m. report, which is the podcast that we do with marketers and founders, asking people what keeps them up at night. So this week's episode was Will and I talking about, it actually came from last week's Thirsty Thursday, which is interesting because there was one of the stories that we covered, which was about the Kraft campaign around send nudes and the fact that it created a lot of unrest among its audiences, with people being offended by it and being like, we are a kids brand, should we really be talking about sending nudes? It was for National Noodle Day, which is why it was like a pun and it was clever, but it was really a big miss on the audience, though they did retract from it well and essentially apologize because their audience was wanting them to keep it a little bit cleaner than they were. So that's what we talked about. It went into a longer, sort of deeper dive into audience focus. We all think we know who our audience is, but if the last 8 months has taught us one thing, it's that nobody has the same psychographic as they did in February of this year. So it's really worth focusing on that, especially as we head into planning season and start thinking about what next year holds. And not a lot has changed, so how are we changing ourselves and our operations, right? So that's something to call out over there. Have a listen. There's a link to the full episode here. Now, what else has been happening? So this week we had a story around the New Yorker writer, and CNN has a legal analyst called Jeffery Toobin. And it was a matter of time, I guess, again, going back to about 8 months since all of this started with the Zoom calls, etc. And I guess things have been going well. And now here you have your first major should I laugh, should I cry kind of scandal, which is that this guy, long story short, if you haven't heard about this, you should Google it. But it's a situation of exposing oneself on a Zoom call where he was apparently on a professional call and a personal call at the same time, and there was some crossing of wires. So this has created a lot of discussion on the interwebs, where I really haven't been following a whole lot of it, but it does show up in the headlines. So if you went previously and hit on Google Jeffrey, you probably got Epstein first. Now you're going to get Toobin, because this is the story. But essentially, for me, I think it makes me pause and reflect, because you're like, whoa, I did not realize that this problem existed in the two-dimensional sphere. And, you know, what does this mean? I don't know. Anyway, so that's the sort of too thirsty on the interwebs story that really stood out. In addition to that, I think there's a couple of things that we're noticing, which relates a little bit more to marketing, because obviously this is a marketing show. One of them, like I already mentioned, is the idea of the planning season. Everyone's starting to plan. I think we've covered a couple of crisis management episodes in which we're like, how do you plan in a crisis? It's not so much the plan as it is a series of scenario planning, right? You're like, if this, then that. And sort of like really preparing for more than one possible outcome, which is essentially not that different from journey mapping, which you did on a smaller scale, but pretty much a journey mapping for your customer as you unfold this whole entire situation. Much as I hate people referencing 2020 as the year of the pandemic, the fact is that a lot has changed for people. And while you don't want to use that as an excuse for not doing things in your business, you certainly want to factor it in where it counts. So really have a little think about what plans look like as we head into November, and focus a bit more on planning different scenarios if that's not something that you've done as a smaller business in the last little while. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on, or rather I have two more things that I want to touch on. Thing number one is the topic of plagiarism. We are fairly active on LinkedIn, and you tend to see a lot of like rants and raves about things. First, everything's super popular, people are on board, and then the infighting begins, and people start to sort of pick on each other and be like, oh, look, you're saying a lot of the same things that somebody else said. And in some cases, that's 100% valid. You really want to be careful, especially if you're directly quoting someone or you're picking a piece of like intelligence that is their intellectual property. You want to be careful about that kind of thing. You certainly don't want to plagiarize anyone. But the fact is, you are in 2020, and a lot of ideas that you have, I've said this before, 99% of the population is probably thinking the same thing, if not has already said some variant of it. So you want to be careful and find your people when you do this, but don't let that stop you from saying the things you do. So this is a time for us to have a little think about intellectual property, who owns it, how do you protect it. In some cases, obviously, it's a matter of like shout out to our client Cynthia Mason of Markably, where getting yourself a trademark on key properties is obviously fairly important. But right now what we're seeing is that it goes beyond all of that into a lot of arguments, and this was my idea first versus your idea first, and a lot of that which is not necessary. So spend some time, I think, being really thirsty for an understanding of intellectual property. And then last, again, as I said, was events and creating that sort of experience online. Now, I know that with the disappearance of conferences and a lot of lavish 2 and 3 day events, people in some industries have been struggling with connecting and creating those networks and going out and creating those learning opportunities for their people. And obviously there was a little bit of everyone going into like a mass exodus into translate my whole event, which used to happen over 3 days in person, into 3 days online. And that doesn't work, you guys. That doesn't work. First of all, you need to shorten your program a whole lot. Secondly, there's a whole lot of experiential components that you need to be adding into your events for people to stay focused and actually get some value out of it. So much like we are big proponents of the podcast medium and video as a medium, it is so totally possible to create infrastructure properties that are based in masterminds and events and workshops. However, in order to set them apart from a copycat, you really want to be focusing on those details. Like, how are people going to make the best of their time? How are you breaking them up into groups? How are you giving them a chance to connect amongst themselves? And of course, don't dismiss the factors like sending them swag. People love the swag. Like, how are you translating that online and preventing the Zoom fatigue? So that's it. That's Thirsty Thursday for the week. Thank you for joining me. Will's going to be back next week.